hit record just now.
Welcome everyone to the Minding the Obligation Gap Summer Learning Institute webinar number 3, featuring the co-authors of the newly released and also under Amazon, #1 new release under education philosophy and a couple of other categories, Minding the Obligation Gap. We're really excited about the response that we have received in terms of the book. We've already had several colleagues contact us and let us know that they will be using the book for their instruction in the fall and some in the spring, who will be teaching courses on community college leadership and courses on community colleges broadly. So we really are overwhelmed and humbled by the tremendous response that we've received for the book, knowing that our nation and the world is going through a variety of different crises. In the United States of America, we have the COVID-19 pandemic that doesn't seem to be slowing down anytime soon, combined with an economic crisis. And then on top of that, you have the uprisings that we're seeing based on a variety of communities realizing the systemic and institutional racism that are experienced primarily by people of African descent in the United States of America. And so for us to have the attention and for us to have the response from our colleagues in education around this work, it is truly, truly appreciated. So today our talk is going to focus on the pedagogy gap, and our facilitator today, we're very honored to have our facilitator today, and I want to read the bio and then bring him on board. Our facilitator has 22 years of experience in higher education. Since 2015, he has served as president of Cosumnes River College in Sacramento. Prior to his position as college president, he served as a tenured associate faculty member in student life and leadership, director of the Educational Talent Search Federal TRIO Grant, dean of student services, and vice president of student services for 7 years. His leadership experience further includes his involvement on statewide committees and initiatives. He currently serves as the Area 2 representative for the California Community College League CEO Board, the CEO representative of the State Chancellor's Office Faculty Diversity Committee, and the Chancellor's Office Student Success Metrics Task Force. Moreover, he is a co-founder and board member of the African American Male Educational Network and Development Incorporated, also known as AMEND, which is nationally recognized as a nationally recognized nonprofit dedicated to improving the educational outcomes for African American men and other men of color enrolled at in the California community college system. He is an innovative leader that has been able to reimagine traditional institutional practices. His innovative approach, including the implementation of guided pathways, have led to improvement of student outcomes while reducing gaps in achievement for students of color and other historically marginalized student populations. He is a student success focused leader that has a clear vision and expertise in leading organizations through periods of change and structural disruption in order to meet the evolving needs of students in the communities which they serve. He's a scholar practitioner and has served as an adjunct faculty member for several graduate programs. Moreover, his academic achievements include the co-authorship of 2 books, 2 book chapters, and 12 peer-reviewed publications appearing in a variety of journals. Moreover, he is a sought-after speaker on issues relating to student success, equity, diversity, and leadership. He has been an invited presenter for numerous local, statewide, and national organizations. Our facilitator today is an educator, what I consider a warrior scholar, who has exemplified not only a commitment to excellence and to social justice, but also a non-compromising commitment to ensuring that our students have what they need, regardless of the level of the ask. Our facility today is not opposed to challenging state legislators, not opposed to challenging the state chancellor's office, not opposed to challenging people within his district, all with a commitment and a heart full of love to ensure that these gaps that we're talking about in this book and these gaps that we talk about on campus are eliminated with all deliberate speed. And it has a sense of urgency about the work that only comes from a person who has allowed this work to go from their head to their hearts. And we have all been benefactors of the great works of this man. I introduce to you none other than Dr. Edward Bush.
Thank you, Asana, for that great introduction. I mean, I truly appreciate it. I'm humbled by it, and certainly don't take what you said for granted. I think in many ways, like all of you, I'm just trying to do my part, trying to do not only what is right, but do what is righteous for the students and the community in which we serve. I am so excited to be engaging in a conversation with you on this outstanding book that I believe is going to be a game changer for community college education. So first, I just want to congratulate each of you as the authors for your hard work, your diligence and dedication, then also from the level of introspection that you had to do that is obvious, that you had to pull from yourself, not only from your academic and professional expertise, but I could tell that you also pull from your spirit as well. And it's apparent when you come out in the writing, and I don't want that to be missed. And I want you to know that I noticed that as well. As you mentioned, Lasana, this is both head and heart work, not only in terms of how we approach our work as educational practitioners, but even how we approach our work as academics. So you guys have definitely modeled that in your book. Also, I want to give a shout out. I recognize a couple of names as I peruse the participants. I believe that there's some Hawks, CRC Hawks in the house. And again, thank you for being on the call, unprompted by me. These are folks who have continuously been dedicated to work around equity and social justice. And so I want to acknowledge them because any success that we had at CRC in closing the opportunity gaps has not been based on my own individual gifts or talents, but because of collective work and wisdom of folks that I work with at the great college known as Cosumnes River College. So I definitely want to acknowledge them. As most of you, man, my mind has really been all over the place for the last couple of weeks as we really attempt to try to grapple with the overt racism that we know that exists, but to see it played out so publicly has been, I think, a reminder for all of us, a wake-up call for some, and a sense of awareness for others. But for me, as an educational practitioner, I think one of the things that we do, particularly as administrators, we are quick to try to find a solution and an answer to how to solve these issues, where oftentimes I think we are impaired by that notion that we often don't sit just observing and being in the situation and having a greater understanding of the dynamics that is happening before we really seek to come up with a solution. But this chapter was helpful in many ways. I wouldn't say that it allowed me yet to come to some conclusions, but it added some additional things that I know that we need to consider, but really laid it out in a way that I think hopefully as articulated, that it may be helpful to others as I begin to think through it. And some of my remarks may appear to be all over the place. And I'm going to say it's more than appear, that likely that is going to be the reality, that I might be all over the place a little bit. But the situation and the problem is so complex and so vast, and I think so daunting, that perhaps being all over the place is a form of having all of your bases covered. So hopefully it will be the latter of that interpretation or that you receive it instead of the former. But a couple of things that stood out as I read this chapter. One of the things that hit me was this insider revelation that I don't think that I stumbled on before as I looked at Dr. Sims' chapter, and a wonderful job. It's this notion of the perpetuation of racism and how that happens within the context of schooling. And we often hear, right, and I think is appropriately so, that racism is taught in the home, that you're taught how to hate in the home, you're taught how to love yourself in the home. Like all those things are attributed to take place in the interaction of raising children. But from when I'm looking at this chapter, I would submit, yeah, that is true. But the fact I think difficult fact that we have to face that I think this chapter presented is racism is also taught in our classrooms. And I'm gonna allow that to sit just for a second, that racism is not just taught at home by folks who look like skinheads, right? Or folks who proclaim to be white supremacists, or those who hold strong bias against another group of individuals that exist in the margins or the periphery of our society based on an individualized set of experiences. If that was just the case, if racism and self-hate and the hate of others was just taught in the home, then it wouldn't be systemic, it wouldn't be structural. So it makes sense that when we talk about structural and systemic racism and anti-Blackness, that we have to look to see what institutions uphold those thoughts that may reinforce those teachings that were taught at home, in many ways may even counter some of the teachings that exist at home. For example, and I mean counter, is that we could send our children to schools loving themselves in their Blackness or in their brownness, only to confront them going to a classroom and not seeing any positive images that reflect who they are in the curriculum, engaging teachers that don't look like them and don't have a same culture understanding. And then our kids come back to us different than how we sent them. And I think when we play that out right into the community college space, we see that reinforcement of, in fact, what is racist ideologies continue inside of the classroom. And one of the things that I think is further highlighted in this book is this idea that there's no such thing as a neutral teaching practice, right? That the curriculum you choose, the content you choose, the textbook, how you teach the course, who you engage and who you don't engage is not neutral. And so when you have a classroom environment that is not intentionally culturally relevant, that where you don't see the experience of folks of color reflected in the textbooks or reflected in the literature or whatever it is that you are unpacking in that classroom, that in fact is a racist act. It's a racist act because it continues to perpetuate an approach to education that have existed since our children first stepped foot on the campus and continue to perpetuate this European standard of education that not only does it cover the curriculum, but how students' behavior is interpreted, so on and so forth. So I think that's one of the first things for me that I had to further understand, or I had some slight understanding, but also gave me language to articulate as I'm in conversations with others. For me as an educational leader, one of the most frustrating things, and make sure you give me a time watch. I'm trying to watch. I know I have 10 minutes, but please give me a countdown.
Will do.
Is the inability to affect what is going on inside of the classroom. When we look at most of our reform efforts within the community college space, much has been around the areas that touch the classroom but doesn't penetrate it. So student services or academic support focus. And we know that type of reform, that type of effort, while it may have some impact and some benefit, that in order to truly move the needle, we have to look at the in-class experience of faculty and students. And to me, this book, and particularly this chapter, as I'm working my way through the remainder of the book, really centers, I think, the attention in terms of where it needs to land. And that is looking at the classroom dynamics. And for us to have the tools and language necessary where the classroom is not off limits to interrogation. That how a faculty member teach is not off limits for critique based on us having an understanding of the impact that has for students of color, Black and brown students in particular, inside of the classroom. That when we fully understand and recognize the harm, when we fully recognize the harm that is being inflicted in the spaces that we call classrooms, we have an obligation to disrupt that. And I'm passing. We got to disrupt that, and I'll leave it there. As I think much of the conversations and questions is going to evolve around that. Thank you for allowing me to share my thoughts. With that, I'll pass it on to Dr. Jennifer Taylor Mendoza.
Thank you, Dr. Bush. And I'll start, Jeremiah, and then you can probably just chime on in. My name is Jennifer Taylor Mendoza, and I'm the Vice President of Instruction at Skyline College. And I just want to thank you, Dr. Bush, for your remarks and just for the realness in all that you do and say. And I appreciate you saying that as you were reading the book, there was a great deal of spirit and introspection, because that is so true. Because I believe that to deal with the deep-seated historical racism and structures that have for years put some behind, have oppressed them, you have to be willing to do deep introspection and really search your soul to move this work forward. So I really appreciate that. A little bit about me. I think I talked already about why and how I came up with the obligation gap. In 2016 is really when I came to sort of terms with just trying to stop making excuses for educators and leaders and just our structure and our systems for not successfully moving certain students or certain populations through, obviously largely Black and brown. This realization came when I was the Dean of Academic Support at the College of San Mateo. I talked about, I had the pleasure of supporting the Project Change program, which is a program that focused on current and formerly incarcerated youth. I found myself really at this time, really not satisfied with the research that was out there, talking about the achievement gap or the opportunity gap, putting so much responsibility on the students when I really felt it was really not the students that were the problems, but the problem was us. And so the obligation is my way of pledging and having an allegiance to the students and to the communities, to the familias, to the villages who support the students whose dreams can be deferred. And so that's what this book is for. It is the concept behind the obligation gap puts the onus on us to put into place. I speak about systems of liberation and freedom, intentional disruptions combined with support both on instruction and student services to insist in colleges, administrators, staff, faculty, and trustees making transformational change. And so for me, this was a deep-rooted sort of soul-searching and love that I had and continue to have. And so I just wanted to speak just briefly to that, and now I'll hand it over to Jeremiah for further comments.
All right. Welcome everyone. Thank you for chiming in. Thank you for participating. And so I just wanted to keep listening to Dr. Bush. I'll be honest, I'm trying to figure out how to cede my time because I want him to keep going. So we'll have to continue this conversation at another time. So we're going to talk about minding the pedagogy gap. So originally, Jennifer opened up, Dr. Taylor Mendoza opened up talking about how the idea for this book came to be. So originally I was going to write a book entirely on the pedagogy gap. And so I spoke to Jennifer and she said, I've really been thinking about this obligation gap. And that struck a chord in me because we do this work, you know, for the most part, we're fairly educated people. There are things that we could do that's not this, but we've opted to do this. And I refuse to believe that everybody's doing this because they can't do anything else, because I know a lot of you people, there's a lot of brilliant folks here. I believe that we are doing this work because we care. And if that's the case, if we care about justice, if we care about equity, then we have an obligation to meet the needs that the students tell us that they have. Not the needs that we foist upon students, not the needs that we think they should have, but we need to figure out what it is they're asking for and understand that we have an obligation, we are obliged to meet them where they are so that they can reach their fullest human potential. And so we talked about what the obligation gap is. We talked about the programming gap and the gap in kind of dean level and above supervisory work. And so now we're going to talk about the pedagogy gap. So just to give some background, I taught in many different spaces. I taught at middle school. I taught at the high school level, community college level, undergraduate and graduate courses. And so my work is in graduate school. My dissertation was on how to infuse critical reality pedagogy, which was a neologism. Y'all familiar with the word? My undergraduate degree is in rhetoric, so we kick around words like neologism. But neologism is a new term or phrase, right? So critical reality pedagogy is the marrying of critical pedagogy, right, from folks like Freire and Giraud and McLaren, with the work of Professor Christopher Emdin, who kind of inaugurated and founded the idea of reality pedagogy. And so my dissertation was on how to infuse critical reality pedagogy in science, technology, engineering, and math, so that not only the outcomes, the measurable outcomes for middle school Black males would increase, but also their kind of ability to situate themselves as applied STEM practitioners, i.e. young people that can use STEM as a lever for social justice. So that's what my dissertation work has been on. I've been looking at the intersections of pedagogy and race for many, many years now. And so this chapter kind of unearthed some of those things, and there's still a lot. You know, Dr. Bush talked about some things that he's still ruminating on, and I'm the same way. You know, I wrote this chapter, but I'm discovering things all the time, and I'm trying to figure out how to best contribute to a conversation that would cause us to think about the way that we interface with students. And so I want to be clear about how I'm qualifying pedagogy in this context. So pedagogy, the pedagogy that I'm speaking of is not limited to a classroom space. A pedagogue is a teacher, right? It's a Greek word. The pedagogy is the way that you teach. If you interface with students in the cashier's office, if you interface with students as an administrative assistant, anytime you are helping them understand how to navigate a space, then there's a particular pedagogy attached to that. So I want to be very, very clear. While there is some focus on classroom teaching and learning, this chapter is not limited to that. Because what we want, what we should want if we're interested, if we are people who are enamored with, even obsessed with justice, then what we want is our students to have the same type of experience no matter where they are on our campus, right? We know what's gonna happen if they go see Dr. Ed Bush, right? He's gonna be welcoming, he's gonna be who he is. But we don't want them to then go to another part of campus and be completely destroyed. So I went to community college for 8 years, off and on, as I was trying to figure it out. And I would have a good time with the counselor, but then I needed to go straighten something out at the cashier's office, and they would just kill my spirit, right? And this can happen anywhere. So what we want to do is be mindful of pedagogy gaps that make it so that students have differential experiences on campus. Now we know that there's some things that need to be discussed. There are different kind of like technical information that needs to be provided, but we want our students to know, irrespective of where they are on our physical campus or our virtual campus, that they are valued, that their voices matter, and that we are there to work in their best interests. And so this is what I'm going to speak to in this particular chapter. So Tabitha, can we go to the next slide? All right, so this is, I want y'all to think about this. I'll just read it. I know folks can read it themselves. It's kind of long. I'm gonna move this out of the way. Okay, a father and a son. So if you've already seen this, then you have, and don't spoil it for other folks. A father and a son sit inside a restaurant finishing up their meal. They look out, they see a big storm. Before they're able to pay and leave, the storm is in full motion. They decide to brave the weather and try to get home. The storm is blinding. It's difficult to see anything past the torrential pour on the road. They decided it's best to pull over. Just before they're able to, they crash. Both of them are in terrible condition. Due to the weather, hospitals in the area are overwhelmed by incoming patients. Upon finding the pair, paramedics decide that the father will be taken to a closer hospital as his injuries are much more severe, and the son will be transported to another hospital with resources. That hospital is 20 miles away. The son is prepped for emergency surgery. He is brought in. When he is brought into the hospital, the doctor slated to perform the surgery lays eyes on the young man and says, "I can't operate on him. He's my son." So what's going on here? I want to hear from folks in the chat. How is this possible? So just chat your answers and we'll spend a couple of minutes on this. All right, so the cat is out of the bag. People have seen this before, or y'all are just brilliant and you figured it out. But for a long time, there was some time ago, actually not that long, a couple years ago, I'd asked the same question. And it was incredibly difficult for people to conceptualize or to imagine that in this particular riddle that I didn't create, the answer is that the mother is the doctor, right? And so in this particular kind of riddle or question, people had an incredibly difficult time coming up with this answer. There would be so many other things, some illogical things, some things that potentially make sense, but it was difficult. And actually, the mother was the least selected response for a number of years. And I'm not going back that far. On the trainings that I've done, I ask this question often, and it's rare for someone to identify, and especially rare when I'm in a room full of men for them to be able to identify the mother as the answer in this particular riddle. So now we can go to the next slide, please. All right, so I want to talk about why that is, right? So it has everything to do with implicit biases, right? And also something called Eichelon effect, right? So I'm not fluent in German, but that was my best attempt. And so so my argument is that Eichelon effect is a phenomenon or an idea that you have in mind. It's your simple initial thought, but you cling to it so dearly that you have a difficult time even considering another thought, which may in fact be a better solution to the problem, right? So normally this term is used in learning sciences and thinking about how people learn, right? And so discussing why students can't pick up new kind of algorithmic thinking is because what they believe the perfect way to answer the question is, they hold on to that so tightly that it precludes them from using new information to answer the question in a more efficacious way, right? So my argument is that deficit thinking is a direct result of this effect, right? So we think there are people who think that certain students can't do well in school based on nothing more than the families that they were born into. This has everything to do with implicit biases, white supremacy, structuralized racism, and then I would argue that what we're actually seeing, right, when all those things congeal, is what is referred to as Eichelon effect, because people are unwilling to try novel approaches to old problems because they feel like the best way to look at it are these pre-existing ways to look at it. And so what we're asking for in this book with regard to pedagogy is a paradigm shift in the way that we operationalize, conceptualize, and deploy critical and critical reality pedagogy in the interest of serving poor ethno-racially minoritized students of color. All right, next slide, please. So our perspectives, right? Aishi-Lung effect has everything to do with our perspective, right? Our perspectives are informed by our idiosyncratic worldviews, which are both informed and formed by our specific cultural, socioeconomic, and socio-historical realities. As educators, we have to take the first position that our worldviews, our folkways, our mores are not universal, but are culturally informed, and as such, they are not purer or truer than any other groups, including our students. So what happens, unless you've done an incredible amount of kind of excavatory work to work on being reflective in your pedagogy, interrupting, reimagining, rebuilding your pedagogy over and over again, what happens is you just teach the way that you were taught. That's what happens, right? For most of us, we teach the way that we were taught because we got to where we are, and so we feel that there's some value there. And oftentimes we default to that. And so that type of default is directly informed by our own idiosyncratic worldviews, the way that we see the world. And so just because we see the world a certain way, so you see this a lot, and Dr. Bush alluded to this earlier, with regard to disciplinary sanctions in K-12 education for Black boys. So Linda Darling-Hammond in her book, The Flat World of Education, talked about a school that she went into, and there was all these Black boys that had been placed in, they'd been tracked into a lower track, right? They were considered to be in need of remediation because they had behavioral issues, and then those behavioral issues were somehow transmogrified into cognitive issues, right? Which happens more often than not with young Black boys. And so it just so happened that these young men couldn't be still in class, and they had a hard time following along. And so for the teacher in their care and the administration that was supposed to care for them, and was doing their best to care for them, I would like to believe, it was easy enough for them to track them in a lower track than to actually try to go deeper and diagnose the larger issues instead of just treating the symptoms. And so what turned out to be the case in this particular example is that these young men just couldn't see. They didn't have access to adequate health care, so they didn't get their eyes tested regularly. Once these young men got their eyes tested, it was clear that they couldn't see the board. And you know, we've all been students. If you can't see the board, it's really, really difficult to pay attention. And so their behavioral issues, which again were culturally normed, right? Their behavioral issues had everything to do with their inability to actually see what was being written on the board and follow along. And so once their eyes were tested and they were given glasses, they did just as well, and in some cases better than their peers. But again, the perspective of the people who were entrusted to care for them allowed them to think that there was some innate or intrinsic deficiency in these young men, rather than to figure out that the issue was a much simpler issue. Next slide, please. This is my other book. So somebody asked about critical reality pedagogy. If you want to be clear on critical reality pedagogy, you have to go to this book because I created the term. So the term didn't exist prior to this. So that's where you will find an explication of critical reality pedagogy. So I want to talk about the achievement gap. I saw this quote. I'll read what's on here. The achievement gap is a red herring argument that obfuscates the real problem. There's a real protracted opportunity gap between low income, first in family, underrepresented students of color and their more well-resourced Asian American and European American counterparts. So the achievement gap is a red herring, which means that it's detracting from the actual issue. If we want to talk about the real issue, we need to talk about the obligation gap and all the constitutive gaps that are part and parcel of the obligation gap, like opportunity gaps, equity gaps. The achievement gap is a byproduct of those things. But the achievement gap, conversations and rhetoric around the achievement gap has won the day in education, especially when you're talking about the education of poor ethno-racially minoritized students of color. And so I want to be clear that if there is a manifest gap in achievement, that is directly related to the chronic disease, which is structuralized racism, white supremacy, and just widespread axiomatic inequity, right? That is macrostructural, that is ubiquitous, and that has become normalized in our educational system. So the achievement gap, again, is produced by these other gaps. So when you fixate on the symptom, you will only ever treat symptoms. You have to address, we have to as critically committed educators, we have to address the chronic disease, right? And that is not the achievement gap. And I found this quote today that I'm going to read to you all. There is no achievement gap. This is from the Subversive Thread. There is a predictable disparity in learning outcomes between well and poorly resourced communities. Calling it an achievement gap obfuscates the generational wealth and access afforded to white students. Creating an equitable educational system means decentering racist outcomes like test scores, grades, and shifting resources to meet historically exploited communities' material and socio-emotional needs. Next slide, please. So again, working to address and treat the achievement gap is what I would consider missing the forest for the trees. Because it's a mistaken causality, it's faulty causality. Instead of identifying equity gaps produced by inequitable microstructural policies and practices, the locus of academic struggle is foisted upon students so that it appears that their academic struggles are at best happenstantial or at worst endemic, right? So what that means is it's what's called a recriminatory strategy, right? Recrimination is when someone accuses you of something, you accuse them right back of accusing you, right? So it's a recriminatory strategy that blames the victim of macrostructural inequity. Oftentimes, because that's what the achievement gap does. Achievement connotes, and it speaks to, you cannot divorce achievement from intrinsic drive, from perseverance to stick-to-itiveness, right? So if you say that these students are on the negative end of the achievement gap, right, then the implicit argument there is that they just need to try harder. They need to demonstrate more grit. There are things that they need to do, but that takes the onus off of the institution, right? And what we're arguing in this book is that it is our obligation to take that onus off of the students. If you think about like romantic comedies, rom-com, right? And the things that come out like in the beginning of the movie, it's not them, it's us. Next slide, please. So equality is not enough. Our goal is not merely to level the proverbial playing field. The people interested in shifting the playing field to their advantage still possess the means of production, right? And so this is metaphorical, including but not limited to bulldozers and other industrial machinery. Therefore, they're fully capable of remaking and reconfiguring the playing field in their favor. So if we're only ever interested in leveling the playing field, so we said we're gonna make it so that all students start at the same place, right? But if there's a student that comes to the starting line of this educational race and they are shackled from head to feet, and you have the key and you don't use the key to allow them to reach their fullest potential, it doesn't matter that they started from the same place. We need to figure out how to make it so that they are not encumbered as they try to reach their fullest potential. The people invested in and that benefit from white supremacy also possess the power to affect policies and practices that uphold white supremacy, right? So these are considerations that we have to have as we try to do this work. Next slide, please. Equity takes the first position that things are not fair, right? So we know that in community college, there's this huge push, even it's just been mandated from the chancellor's office around equity, and equity is important. You know, my position, I'm the director of student equity, right? I understand that there is a need for equity, but I want to caution folks to temper your expectations, because equity is only the first step, right? Equity acknowledges that things aren't fair. And that we must start there. But what I'm arguing for, what this book is arguing for, is a justice-centered analysis that seeks to demystify the malevolent designs that ensure that injustices are suffered by poor ethno-racially minoritized students of color. Because we know that equity is a big deal. We know that there's been a push for equity, and we need it, but we can't stop there. We have to continue to move forward towards justice. Next slide, please. So this is along the same lines. Equity is just the beginning. Working for justice, unlike equity, fixates on chronic diseases like white supremacy, settler colonialism, heteropatriarchy, et cetera, not just the symptoms produced by these systems of power, accrual, and differentiation. Next slide, please. I already read that one. Next one, please. All right, so this chapter that we're going to get into a little bit deeper outlines some of the pressing issues and obstacles that Black males face simply by virtues of the family that they are born into due to structural and institutionalized racism and inequity. So these are questions. These are discussion questions. So I want to hear from folks. Don't go crazy. Don't put your master's thesis or your dissertation in the chat, but I want to hear you answer these as best you can. How will you account for the obstacles that Black males face and support them academically without lowering your expectations for them? And then the second question, so just choose one. If you accept the presupposition that there is no liminal, there's no middle space, there's no liminal space in education, how does that then change the way that you position yourself in your classroom vis-a-vis your students? So just pick one of these questions and limit it to 2 sentences. And I just want to hear from some folks. How do you address these things? And I'm just going to pause while people type. There's some great answers here.
Yeah, and others can't, I think, view what's in the chat, so it might help to read off.
Oh, okay, so I'll read a few. They're going really quickly, so let me see. Sorry if folks can't see the chat. Comprehensive review of college practices and district policies, understanding the obstacles. You have to create systems, structures, and policies. Position yourself fully on the side of the students. Listen to their narrative. Contextualize content in such a way that students experience their education through their own lives. Providing students with the truth, positioning yourself as an advocate, engaging students in ongoing development as a self-learner, thoughtful performance reviews of faculty to provide them with PD. They need to revamp their syllabi and their course outlines. Engage students. There's a lot of conversation around engagement, and we have to do that. We've been doing that, and we have to continue to do it. All right, so I'm going to go to the next slide, please. Thank you all. All right, so we have to strive for justice. This is what I'm arguing for. This is disruptive. It's disruptional. Because if we only ever stick with equity the way that it's currently conceived, I'm afraid that we're going to plateau, and we're going to plateau sooner than we think. So our goal has to be to strive for actual justice. If we desire to be justice-centered educators and practitioners, we are obligated to create opportunities that ensure that poor ethno-racially minoritized students of color are equipped with the understanding that the field of play must be changed if they are ever to reach their fullest potential. So we want to equip, empower, and encourage students to not only work within the system that they've been forced to navigate, but to use their education and envision it as a way to change the system so that the obstacles that have been placed before them can be done away with for them and for others that follow them, right? So the work is always, for me as an educator, to work alongside students to empower them to be change agents so that they can positively impact the neighborhoods, whether they be local, national, global, that are of the most concern for them. Instead of encouraging poor ethno-racially minoritized students of color to work to gather the crumbs that fall off the master's table, we must work to provide every opportunity for them to be empowered and equipped to begin reimagining both the shape and the function of the systems and policies that continue to serve the interests of white supremacy. This work is exigent because all policies, practices, and pedagogies that function in the interest of white supremacy necessarily function to the detriment of poor ethno-racially minoritized students of color. I'm going to read that again. There is no liminal space. All, not some, but all policies, practices, and pedagogies, and I would add curricula, that function in the interest of white supremacy necessarily function to the detriment of poor ethno-racially minoritized students of color. There's no other way to look at it. Next slide, please. So what is justice-centered pedagogy? A set of teaching practices that aim to create equitable social and academic outcomes for students in urban schools. Classroom culture that normalizes attention to historical and persistent suffering and injustices in the lives of students, and carry intellectually rigorous high expectations that connect pedagogy to harsh realities. Next slide, please. All right, so this is a conversation around the pedagogy of the oppressed, right? If folks are familiar with the banking model of education, the banking model of education suggests that as educators, we are the knowers and the students that we speak to are the knowees. So we, out of our own benevolence, we infuse our knowledge into them, and then they regurgitate that knowledge back to us, and that's supposed to be proof of learning. And so what Freire is saying is that type of anti-critical educational model, educational approach, disallows criticality, and criticality is necessary for traditionally marginalized students if they ever want to realize that they're being oppressed and then do something about it. All right, so the asymmetrical power dynamic in the banking model of education produces a dialectical relationship where poor ethno-racially minoritized students of color must routinely check their respective cultures at the door of the classroom in order to avoid sanction for behaviors that run counter to the acceptable norms of the peoples that wield power over them, i.e. the people that have the power to impact their future educational and career aspirations. Next slide, please. There is no middle ground. Any situation in which some individuals prevent others from engaging in the process of inquiry is one of violence. To alienate human beings from their own decision-making is to change them into objects. That's from Freire, from Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Developing disruptive technologies designed to shrink the pedagogy gap is a necessary component of achieving educational equity and ultimately justice. I think of this as a linear process. We're working towards educational equity. Once we're able to apprehend educational equity and work towards that, once we know what it looks like, once we are able to look at our policies, take inventory of our policies and our practices and our pedagogies and our curricula, so that we root out the anti-Black and other forms of racism, right, and the misogyny and the sexism and all the other isms that are there, we're on our way towards justice. We're not there yet, but once we're able to enact these, policy, practices, pedagogical and curricular changes, right, we're marching firmly towards the type of educational justice we need to serve all of our students well. Next slide, please. All right, white supremacist positioning makes the concretization of the status quo commonsensical. This hegemonic relationship purposefully elides critical inquiry. In this asymmetrical dyad, the knower knows and the knowledge is unquestioned. So what this is saying, this is kind of like Berkeley speak, right? This is something I wrote many, many years ago while I was still a graduate student, and I had to talk like that. What this is saying is that the ideas around deficit model thinking, right? Ideas that certain students are just not college, just are not four-year college material, or that these students are trying and they're doing well in school in spite of the familial backgrounds because you just kind of know that their parents aren't supporting their education at home, right? These kind of conceptions are based in white supremacist, racist ideas, and they have been concretized to the point where they're commonsensical, right? So you can see these 2 points. I wrote these 2 points. When I started in community college, I missed my opportunity to take the assessment test. And so the counselor that I spoke to automatically put me in remedial writing in my first semester of community college. But I wrote this, right? I wrote, white supremacist positioning makes the concretization of the status quo commonsensical. This hegemonic relationship purposefully elides critical inquiry. So without knowing who I was, just by looking at me, and I look different then, I probably had gold teeth and gold earrings and a really big cross. Irrespective of all those things, right? All those different parts of my identity kit at that time, there was no conversation about what I was capable of. I was automatically placed in remedial writing. And that had everything to do with the commonsensical notion that my culture, my Black culture, was antithetical to schooling success. So in order to liberate poor ethno-racially minoritized students of color from the pedagogy of the oppressed, we must work to first apprehend and subsequently catalyze what amounts to an educational paradigm shift. All right, next slide, please. So we have to do better. Most educators feel that culturally relevant pedagogy is optional. This is simply not true. Pedagogies predicated on cultural fluency are necessary if we hope to achieve educational equity. Equitable pedagogical practices are predicated on a desire to eliminate systemic institutionalized barriers for traditionally marginalized students so that they can be positioned to realize their full academic and human potential. All right, next slide, please. And we're gonna make all this available. I understand that it's a lot of words. I apologize for that. Normally I wouldn't put this many words on a slide, but this is a really long chapter. I probably should have broken it up, but it's about 70 pages. And so I'm trying to give an overview as best I can. So we need to move away from the banking model of education. We talked about this, right? The banking model of education is anti-critical. Because it's anti-critical, it stultifies and stifles, especially poor ethno-racially minoritized students of color. The banking model of education presupposes that students are devoid of agency, expertise, and valuable input. If you're teaching in this way, you have to examine why you're teaching in this way. If you only ever, right, and right now what's going on, which is the irony of it, this is an example of the banking model of education, right? I am passing all this information to you all now. I don't have the power to assess how you do on this, right? I don't get to gauge the learning. Normally, this is not what we would have, but webinars don't lend themselves to a large conversation, right? So we know that we're doing things differently now. The pedagogy of the press serves to limit the possibilities for poor ethno-racially minoritized students of color because it disallows students to question, critique, and ultimately challenge the systemic forces that work to concretize their impression. Next slide, please. We must work to create educational spaces that are rigorous and culturally affirming and sustaining for poor ethno-racially minoritized students of color. I want to take up this point around socio-academic synergy. Socio-academic synergy is a kind of a triumvirate that has been folded together as a braid, right? So it alloys rigor, relevance, and relationships, right? The 3 R's, folks have heard of that. So that's what socio-academic synergy is, right? So there's a synergistic relationship between students' real lives and the work that they do in whatever schooling milieu they're in. And so oftentimes when you ask faculty folks, doesn't matter, K to 22, to change the way that they're doing things, one of the things they'll counter that with is, well, I can't sacrifice rigor. I cannot, right? As though rigor and culturally affirming teaching are mutually exclusive. And the argument that this book is making is they're not only not mutually exclusive, they're actually mutually constitutive and mutually beneficial. So socio-academic synergy, I go into more detail with that in this book. Socio-academic synergy is an intentional move to ensure synergism between course content, pedagogies, and student real-life concerns, experiences, and expertise. We know from learning sciences, and if you think about this yourself, you know that in order, if something registers quickly for you and you learn that thing, there's oftentimes an emotive connection with that. And so we need to work to make sure that we're not teaching things in a decontextualized way. People will say in the hard sciences, you know, well, how am I supposed to teach math in a way that's culturally sustaining, right, or culturally affirming? And my question would be, how can you not teach math in a way that's culturally sustaining and culturally affirming? If you look at Eric Gutenstein's work, Reading and Writing the World Through Mathematics, the book that I mentioned that I wrote, math has everything to do with real life. I worked with a group of students and we were doing computer science, right? And so we got the students together. We split them off into two groups. These are all young Black males, right? And there was one group was an ABCD group, asset-based community development. The other group was a problem-posing group. The asset-based community development group identified the program that they were in, the program that my dissertation was on, as a benefit to their community because it was based in Oakland. The other students identified joblessness as the biggest issue in their community. So then they got together, right? These guys are like from 10 and a half to 13, and they determined that they wanted to use a course taught by who's now a professor at Northwestern University, Professor Sapir Vakil, which is a course on computing and social justice. They wanted to create a mobile application that would alert 14, 15, 16-year-olds of jobs that would hire them with just a work permit, no prior work experience. So what these students had done at that point, right, these teenagers and preteens, is they used STEM as a lever for social justice. And my argument is that that type of work is not only necessary, but it's not as difficult as people think it is. We have a instructor in our system, Kenyatta Weathersby, who teaches statistics, and he taught about the water crisis in Flint, Michigan, to have conversations with community college students, right? So it contextualized issues that people were facing. And so socio-academic synergy allows for and invites and celebrates the real lives of the students, not just in ceremonial things, which I'm not being dismissive of, right? It's not just during February that we put up some posters, right? Or on Cinco de Mayo, we put up or have some type of celebration. But the idea is that the students are part and parcel of the meaning-making process that goes on in the course, and their real life concerns, joys, considerations are part of the curriculum material that is being covered so that they can engage in it in a real and meaningful way. Next slide, please. And we have to be malleable, right? We have to. Educators must develop radical pedagogical structures that provide students with the opportunity to use their own reality as a basis for literacy, for STEM, for whatever it is that we teach. This includes obviously the language they bring to the classroom. To do otherwise is to deny students the rights that lie at the core of an emancipatory literacy. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to talk quickly about critical pedagogy. Critical pedagogy takes the first position that education is intrinsically and intractably political. There is no neutrality with regard to education. The goal of a critical pedagogical approach is to re-empower PERMs, I'm just going to shorthand, by presenting them with the necessary tools to come to a universal consciousness so that they can begin to exercise their power to deconstruct the ideological and juridical bulwarks of inequity that have and continue to wreak havoc on their lives. Next slide, please. And then reality pedagogy. So remember, I talked about critical reality pedagogy, which is what this chapter is being kind of impelled by, is a marriage between critical pedagogy and reality pedagogy. The 5 C's of reality pedagogy. If you haven't seen it already, you should check out, Professor Emden has a few books. His most recent book, which is a bestseller, was called For White Folks That Teach in the Hood and the Rest of Y'all Too. And he has a bunch of talks on YouTube, but there's one from 2016. It's fairly short. It's a TEDx talk where he talks about and kind of explicates the 5 C's of critical pedagogy. So I highly recommend that video. Co-generative dialogues, co-teaching, cosmopolitanism, context, and then he purposefully put content last. Next slide, please. So here's critical reality pedagogy. Students should not only be encouraged, so the way that I envisioned or conceptualized critical pedagogy was by using the metaphor to think about critical thinking. Critical thinking, right? Ideas that you think outside of the box. Critical reality pedagogy takes up that same type of metaphor, but students should not only be encouraged to think outside of the box, but rather they should be also empowered, encouraged, and equipped to critically analyze the box's position to determine who is benefiting and conversely who is being penalized by the box's existence and positionality. So you don't just think outside the box. You turn around and look at the box and figure out whether or not you need to deconstruct the box so that it's commensurate with social justice. Right? This is the heart of critical reality pedagogy. Critical reality pedagogy should situate pedagogical practices within a larger socio-political context. We should develop ways to situate students' learning within a real life context. It should help students make tangible connections between their lives outside of the classroom and the course content. It should help us reconceptualize rigor and situate rigorous learning within a larger socio-political context. It should facilitate students' growth regarding development of students' identities as critical applied justice practitioners, and it should invite students to co-create meaning with us because they share this classroom with us. Next slide. All right, last question. I'll leave it at this and you can fill this in. In the meantime, while you're working through this question, so how do you, or how will you, if you don't currently, create equitable educational opportunities for your traditionally marginalized students, including Black males? And I just wanted to qualify because there was a comment. So these questions are pulled out of a book that centered the experiences of Black males. So I know that not only do other Black people, Black women, right, they matter as well, right? And other ethno-racial identities matter, but this is a specific question that had to do with a specific study, and that's why Black males are being highlighted in this. So including Black males to use the knowledge and competencies they gain in your class to create innovative ways for them to address social issues that they deem worthy of redress. Basically, the question is this: how are you helping, or how do you plan to help students that you work with figure out ways to use the knowledge that they're gaining in your class for social justice? And so while you're doing that, I'm going to introduce Tabitha, Dr. Tabitha Conaway, who is going to cover chapter 5. I believe it's chapter 5. Here we go, sorry. So Tabitha currently works at the College of San Mateo as the Interim Dean of Enrollment Services and Support Programs. For over 13 years, Tabitha has devoted her career to supporting hyper-marginalized students. Her research interests include juvenile hall to college pipelines for previously incarcerated youth, counter-narratives, and creating educational equity concerns for historically underserved and underrepresented students in higher education. Tabitha holds a BA in African American Studies from the University of California, Los Angeles, an MA in Education with a specialization in teaching in a global society from National University, an MA in History from California State University, Sacramento, and a doctorate in education from San Francisco State University. And she'll get some more degrees while she's at it. But anyway, without further ado, here is Dr. Tabitha Conaway.
Thank you all. Let me kind of skip. You're done with these slides, Dr.
I'm done.
Sims?
I'm done.
Okay. So for everybody on the webinar, thank you. Dr. Sims and I co-facilitate a PD at CSM, and so this is the usual pattern for us. He over-prepares, and then we work together on this. So he's laughing. So I do apologize. This was supposed to be a poll, but it's going to help you in the long run, because then I won't be able to chastise you for any failing marks you get. So this is going to work better for the webinar, because then you won't feel so called out. This is out of order. So here's my pop quiz. There's 3 questions, and this is going to tell me everything I need to know about you as an educator. Ready? So question 1, and just so you know, Dr. Sims wrote this quiz, so if you have concerns, go see him. So through your neighborhood on Zenith Spokes in Flamboston. Question 1, based on the quote above, what is the definition of Flamboston? Is it A, telling untruths in a bombastic, hyperbolic manner? B, a component of slam poetry where the audience is addressed directly? C, a kind of aggrandizing that combines flamboyance and boastful proclamations? Or D, a paint job that is iridescent? So go ahead and put your answers in the chat. I'll give you some time. I will tell you what Lasana informed me of earlier. If all else fails, go with C. That is his premise. So if some of you all choose C, there is no shame in that. All right. I can't see the chat, so panelists, will you guys give me a thumbs up when it looks like people are done responding?
A few people really want it to be D, but C is winning the day right now.
Well, okay, we'll keep going. All right, so that was question 1. Remember, there's only 3 questions, so you need at least 2 correct to pass. This is very important. Number 2, I got the gift of gab. I'm off the choo-choo track. I want the Fetty, the fame, y'all can have that. So please define feting. Is it A, a celebratory adulation heaped on someone that is looked up to? B, currency? C, the attention of a potential love interest? Or D, respect of one's peer? Okay. I'm glad this is a webinar because I would imagine that I have a lot of audience rolling their eyes at me, but I'll explain, just bear with me. All right. And question 3, this is your fill in the blank. Got a little Gouda, got a thumper, got a Ruger. What is Gouda referring to in the above quote? Please define for yourselves and put in the chat. If you have sources, feel free to cite them. Okay, well, let's start this conversation. Why did I start here? Was it to embarrass you all on your lack of knowledge of E40? That was not it. I'll tell you, as an LA native, I got these correct. I don't want to say I didn't, I did. But as an LA native, this isn't naturally my cultural context, right? But why did I start here? I started here because when Jeremiah and I were talking about how can we create a long-term PD for faculty, staff, and administrators, when we were asking people kind of what they thought about their own practices, when we started disaggregating data about course success rates, about retention rates, and we started talking to people about their data and highlighting a lot of the disparities that I'm sure may be common in our institutions, right? When we were calling out our Black males are failing, when we were calling out our Pacific Islanders were failing courses, or we were not retaining them, when we were not retaining our Latina students in English, and we started having these conversations about, well, what's going on? A lot of responses that Jeremiah and I received were talking about like race neutrality and colorblindness, and staff and faculty may not have used those phrases, but that's what they were referring to. They were saying things that I'm sure are common, like, I teach all my students the same, right? I teach all my students the same, and I don't see color, or my teaching practices are easy to follow. If such and such group can succeed, right, ... then why aren't these other students? And it helps people fall into this deficit thinking, right? When we view our practices and our pedagogy as race neutral. There's no such thing, right? There's no such thing as race neutral practices. But because our educational system reifies white middle class values, and we have state sanctioned schooling that has historical legacies of assimilation, it is easy to feel safe in this area of cultural blindness. To say, I know people have culture, but it doesn't impact the way they learn. It shouldn't impact the way I teach. I teach everybody the same. And so Jeremiah and I have facilitated a number of PDs, and we've started with this quiz a number of times because I think it's easy for faculty and staff to feel uncomfortable with that quiz. When I tell you taking this quiz is going to tell me how I feel about you as an educator or how you see yourself, it's not if you fail or pass, right? Because we understand everything has a cultural context. E40 has a cultural context. It has a locale, it has a location. But how you view that is important, right? How you view bringing culture into your classroom is important. And so starting with an E40 quiz places a lot of people in an area where they realize culture does matter, right? culture matters when we bring it to the classroom. On a side note, Jeremiah and I did have a board of trustee member come and take that quiz and get 100%. So I'm just putting that out there. But really the goal of the quiz is to get practitioners to start asking the question, well, what does it look like when we intentionally center students' experiences and empower students to build on the wealth they bring with them, right? In the PD, we want our faculty and our staff and our administrators who participate to come to this conclusion themselves. We want them to ask this question. And that's why we start with the quiz that makes people feel uncomfortable, that makes people feel like it's out of place, that makes people reevaluate the role that culture plays in the classroom and in other spaces of learning. So what does it look like? How do we imagine that? And so this frames our first discussion of what that may look like, because it leads to a number of discussions, right? When we ask ourselves, well, what does it look like when we intentionally center students' experiences? The other question becomes, why aren't we doing it now? And so it has the conversation of putting our educational system into context for educators who, as Jeremiah alluded to, often don't have a background in teaching and learning, right? We teach the way we are taught. And so I know even for myself, my first year teaching, I went home, I would go home crying. I would go home crying because what I was doing wasn't working, but it was the only thing I knew. The teacher, all I do is lecture. I didn't understand that that may not be the most effective way. I didn't understand how to bring my culture or the students' culture into the classroom because it wasn't taught, right? It wasn't taught why lecturing may not work for everybody. It wasn't discussed. And so we have to start looking at these practices and realizing that there's no race-neutral practices. Understanding that within our classrooms, when we say race-neutral, we are saying that we are valuing white middle-class values as the litmus for success. That we are stating that the things that our students bring with them, the ways of knowing, their culture, their practices, that all of these things are not important. And instead, we are willing to say that we accept a system that pathologizes the culture of our students and criminalizes our students. And that's not okay. And that is not why educators get into this field, but they think that they can be safe, right? They think they can be safe in saying they're race neutral, and you cannot. And so this is where Jeremiah and I start the conversation, right? We start the conversation around why neutrality doesn't work and how we have a system currently that targets our students of color, specifically our Black and Latino males in schools, that they are targeted and racialized and criminalized in a way that they have been pushed out of many schools, right? This drawing is from one of my students who earlier in the webinar, you heard Dr. Taylor Mendoza talk about Project Change. Well, this is from one of those students. It's from a 17-year-old student who was incarcerated taking college courses with me as their instructor. And when I asked them, what is the single story that people tell about you or that you feel about education, this is what he drew. That he didn't have a future basically in education because he was bad. And even though it doesn't show this in the drawing, when I asked him about it, what do you mean? What he expressed to me was that his actions were criminalized. Everything he did, right? Instructors didn't like the way he talked. They didn't like the way he dressed. He was called a thug, and he was pushed out of classrooms, right? It wasn't just K through 12. Sometimes we like to think it ends there, but we have systemic racism and anti-Blackness within our schooling structures that if we are not intentional, they are the dominant force. We have to be intentional in the way we structure our practices. And that is the goal of the training series that Jeremiah and I co-facilitate. We start with this theoretical analysis, right? We start with a discussion of the historical nature of schooling in the United States. We start with colonization and racialized capital. We talk about other concerns, and then we start thinking about what are ways to address these concerns, right? So we talk about other learning theories. We talk about cultural sustaining pedagogies. We talk about critical reality pedagogy and critical pedagogy that Dr. Sims so eloquently shared as a way to address these large institutionalized racist practices that harm our students, because we want our faculty and staff and administration to realize that we cannot be neutral. So once they have this basis of theory and learning theories, we talk about their instruction. It says instructional design, but it's really, what's the design of your practice? And that could be instruction if you're a faculty, but as Dr. Sims stated, we are very intentional when we talk about pedagogy and we talk about impacting our campus. It's not just faculty, right? Everyone has a pedagogy, a way in which they approach how they are teaching students, if that's student services or faculty. So once we have this theory, this theoretical basis, a common understanding that we are all learning and growing and discussing together, then as a group, we begin to take these theories and put them into practice. So if that is redoing a lesson plan based on a theory, if it is trying out a new activity, if it is rewriting how you do a practice in a student service space, this is a time for that, right? Because we've built a community where we are learning together, where we are growing together, and where we can talk to our peers about why something didn't work, right? We've had faculty try new things. We've had biology faculty within our training share with us, I wanted to highlight the diversity of biology professors, but what I thought I was going to get were students highlighting Black or Latino professors, but instead I got papers all written about Indian biology professors. And she shared, well, why did that happen? And as a group, we problem solved, right? We problem solved, well, were you intentional in your language? Did you say what you meant by diverse? Did you define, did you have these conversations with your students? And so we took theory into practice and talked about it as a group. And then from that, we came together and distilled core tenets that we thought were very representative of the things we had learned. And all of this is under the guiding question of how can equitable educational practices be leveraged to encourage, empower, and equip all students to succeed academically and beyond. I want to give an example. If I go back, see, you guys are being subjugated to my history class now. I'll go back and forth on slides. But when we talk about theory to design to best practices, if I give an example from a staff perspective, I have a very close colleague, Dr. Tovo, who coordinates our Mana Learning Community. It's a learning community supporting Pacific Islander students. And in conversation with her, this practice is what she's done, right? She saw that many people were looking at her students from a deficit perspective. And if I take a very granular approach, in terms of completing financial aid packets. She noticed that her students in her learning community were not completing the FAFSA. And there were a lot of reasons why people suggested this may be true, many of them very deficit focused. Dr. Tovo felt that she needed to build on her students' strengths, and she identified one of the strengths of her community as family. So she called together a family night where you had parents and students all come together for a norm session of what the year was going to look like, but she also had financial aid representatives available so that the families could work directly with the financial aid office to complete this. So this is one way that she addressed her students and trying to build on their strengths, right? And so when we talk about determining best practices, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about looking at a strength that our students bring with them and building upon that and incorporating that into the institution and the way we do work, instead of trying to make our students convert to how we want to do the work. And so kind of just to get into the nuts and bolts of the PD really quickly, we had a lot of objectives and outcomes and skills we want to develop. But from a larger scale view, we wanted people who went through the PD to be able to empathize with people from different walks of life. We wanted people who completed the PD to be able to call into questions their own worldview and to realize that their perspective and their viewpoint is not always right, that equally as important are the students. And we wanted to be intentional that people left the year-long PD being able to identify and meet the needs for our traditionally marginalized students. And so we did this through a year-long process. I said a year. We had a one semester monthly meeting session. So we would read collectively, we would have guest speakers. Once a month we would come together, discuss the guest speaker, discuss the readings, and have time to work together on lessons or practices. Summer, we had a 2 to 5 day planning session to get ready for fall. And in fall, we had flex day activities as well as office hours. We practiced incorporating equity office hours so that people who were content area experts and working towards achieving educational equity could support their departments, right? Oftentimes, what Jeremiah and I found were that people disassociate content and equity. And if they want to talk about equity, they might go to Jeremiah's office. If they wanted to talk about content, they would go to department people, and they would never marry the two. And so we were hoping by having content area experts who are also striving for educational equity that we could begin to see large-scale change on our campus. And so we have a lot of, I know that you didn't want me to read all of the participant voices. I mean, I could have tried to put different hats on, but I knew that we weren't as high tech as Lasana with the video. So I just have this one quote up. But I think it's important to note that just as the Equity Institute at Skyline, we did have faculty, staff, and administrators. We also had a lot of adjuncts participate. And I will say, for the first 3 years of our program, we were very intentional. We paid our adjuncts. We paid our adjuncts to come because we wanted to ensure that everybody had access to coming to campus. And oftentimes the people who interact with our students are kind of left out of this pay process. So we wanted to ensure that adjuncts could participate. We wanted to ensure that staff could participate. So we worked with managers to ensure they could come during their regularly scheduled hours. And I think I'm done. All right.
Good. Thank you all. It's a lot of information, a lot of good information to process. Definitely has been a rich, very rich set of information presented. With that, we're going to open it up for questions and answers. We could focus specifically on areas of Chapter 4 or anything highlighted in Dr. Sims and Tabitha's presentation. So I'll go ahead and monitor the Q&A to pose any questions that you may have. And maybe I'll get it started, allow folks a second to get their questions, and I'll address this to any of the panelists, but I think Dr. Sims may be more appropriate to you as I look at Chapter 4. You talk about emancipatory education. I mean, I think you're really up to ante in your chapter, from just a frame of talking about equity to talking about education as a form of liberation. So within that context, how would you define success for the student?
That's a great question. Thank you, Dr. Bush. And so for me, I want to be very clear about success. So I started a program some years ago. Again, my dissertation was based on this work, and so there's a bridge between this work and the work that I'm doing now. In that particular program, there was a push to measure success. There was always a push to measure. Anytime you're dealing with Black and brown students, right, it gets really, really mechanized the way that you have to work with them. People need to be able to see numbers to almost prove their humanity in some respect, right? Because we don't want to waste dollars on these Black and brown folks if they're not getting the numbers that we need. And so there was always a push, and as the founding director of that program, I had to balance that. But I had to be clear with the people funding the program. I don't really care if all these students get 100% on their tests and they don't have any civic consciousness and they don't have a concern for their local, national, and global communities. And so it got to the point where the funder, who was a European-American gentleman who had seen a lot of atrocities because he grew up in the South, and he was a liberal ACLU member who supported Obama. He said, Jeremiah, I'm tired of hearing the same things from you with regard to this program, because one of the students wrote this really perspicacious paper about redistribution of wealth. And rich people don't like to talk about redistribution of wealth, right? And he said, I feel like this young man is talking about me in this paper. I said, he absolutely is talking about you. And he said, well, I've done this, I've done this. He said, the problem, Jeremiah, is that you're creating a program filled with young Black victims. So he told me. I said, nah, man. I got that from LaShawn Shirt. Nah, I'm creating a program filled with young Black Panthers who know how to leverage STEM for social justice. So for me, emancipatory learning has to position students to use their knowledge to create a more just society. If they just using it to pass tests, that's not compelling enough for me. The work that I do is to position students to be able to use their knowledge bases so that they can change the systems that have wreaked havoc on their lives and the lives of people who have similar walks of life for our whole history in this country. So that is what success looks like for me. Of course, do the things, get the academic register down, not so that it changes who you are, but it's another tool in your toolkit so that then you can use that to get into spaces that you were previously disallowed from, so that you can make a change. That's the whole reason I got a PhD, right? So I can have these conversations now. And I can make this, for me, it's guerrilla warfare, to be completely honest. You fight where you are, and I think that we need to position our students to fight wherever they are, whether it be in classroom spaces or wherever else. So that's what success looks like for me. You do the work, you use the tools, you fill up your tool belt, and you use all those things for justice.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Sims. Was anyone else, any other panelists want to chime in on that? If not, go to the question. And the first question I'll read is from one of the great administrators of Cosumnes River College. It says, do you all have any data showing how practices adopted have improved outcomes for our Black and brown students?
So I can speak to this
quickly.
Yes. Yeah, I'll just go on real quick and then somebody else can jump on. So right now, this is a longitudinal process. So with other studies, yes. With the particular work that's being unearthed in the chapter that Dr. Conaway just so eloquently summarized for us, we haven't seen it yet because the program is relatively new. So that takes a second layer of testing, right? So right now we're working with faculty and administrators to get them to a point where we feel like they can do and have license to do, and some of them are already doing it, but have additional language to do work that would positively impact poor ethno-racially minoritized students of color. But we're not yet at that level where we've tried to assess that. So the short answer is no, but that's something that we have and that we're going to continue to work towards. So stay tuned.
No, I apologize, Dr. Conaway. I call you Tabitha earlier. I'm just
okay.
reading the names as is written on my screen. So my apologies. Go ahead.
No, okay. I will say, in addition to what Dr. Sim said, we don't yet have data, but I think we need to be wary, right? When we're talking about, is there data that shows this? There's so many other factors that go into student success. And so I'll tell you, from the start of the PD series to now, our student success has increased. Can we connect that directly to this PD? I would argue no, but I would say that we are having more educators willing to have this conversation, and that may not show in student success data, but it does show in other realms of campus culture. We recently redid our program review process in conjunction with Academic Senate to focus more on equity. So instead of our previous program review that just said, look at your data, now we call it out, right? We're calling out, do you have disproportionately impacted groups? What is your plan to address this? How are you going to support these students? So while I am hopeful that we will continue to see increased success numbers in terms of quantitative data, things are happening on campus. Conversations are happening in a much broader sense than they once were. Even recently, when we talk about the work of Dr. Sims on campus, there was a time when he couldn't say, how are you incorporating anti-racist pedagogy? And now he can. So I think there's other changes happening. And I think from a qualitative perspective, we also hear this from our students, that they feel more welcome, that in terms of subjects, they're more willing to engage in conversations and more willing to enroll in courses in which they had stopped enrolling altogether.
Yes, I mean, I think this is a good segue, Dr. Conway, to the next question that is actually from a student, Hannah. She asked, as a student, what can I do to help organize my peers to analyze and challenge the box context of our education system? Again, I'll open up to that for any of the panelists that wants to address that question.
That's a Lasana question right there when you're talking about organizing. So
yeah, I was gonna head there. So yeah. Thank you, Dr. Sims.
So in terms of, it says specifically analyzing the box or context of the educational system. So it's a variety of ways in which you can do that. Fortunately, our institutions post the performance of our students and our demographic makeup on our websites. And so you want to access the data. We also post the student equity plan. And the student equity plan has a list of the disproportionate groups as well. And between those two documents, what we can do is organize the students around what the data is saying about the students who aren't being served, and then hold the institution accountable to saying what are the direct actions that the organization is taking place, what are the resources that are being leveraged, and what are the assessments, what are the outcomes that are being assessed to make sure that we close these gaps. So that's in particular the data. As far as client, it's very important that I recommend students, when they come together to organize, that they have some specific, they know victory looks like. What does a win look like, right? So it's not just saying, hey, we're not happy about the climate. Hey, we're not happy about how we feel. You say, well, we're not happy about these things. And as students, this is what we would like to see in response. And you have a list of requests prioritized. And then once those lists of requests are prioritized, then you have something to engage administrators with. There you have something to engage the institution with, so that you can now not only be able to express your grievances, but you and your peers have talked about what does it look like for us to have our grievances addressed. Because one thing coming from a background as a student organizer is that if you just air grievances, but there's no reconciliation, there's nothing that the institution can do. The institution is not going to, so if that's, you're not going to get that. But if you say, these are the things we want to see in place, these are some positions we think that are missing, our campus doesn't have cultural studies in the way that it does, it's not staffed the right way, we don't like the demographic makeup of our faculty, they don't represent the students that are here. Those kinds of things, those kinds of lists give you an opportunity to really engage the institution with measurable response, reforms, and even
any other panelists want to add or build on Lasana's response or answer? All right, next question. I'm going to try to summon Ron, who is pulling together honest, but also uplifting how these type of courses put together quickly for disability support. So looking to marry areas in STEM and social science. So bringing those two disciplines together.
Can you all hear
So
me?
I think we're looking at particularly innovative. No, go ahead. Now we hear you now.
Okay, so can you repeat the question? Because my connection is going in slow motion right now.
Yeah, so this is from Ronald, who's currently looking to put together a course in Black statistics.
Okay.
And so he's, he said he wants to build on the idea of emancipatory learning. Questions, how do you build support for this type of interdisciplinary work to take place at his college?
This is Ronald from City College?
Correct.
Ron, just call me, Ron. Call Kenyatta. That's all you got to do. So Ron, I think that you just need to call Kenyatta, man. Kenyatta has been working through this. So Kenyatta is a professor at Skyline College, and he's the one that I mentioned earlier, who worked with me to help to birth the program that my dissertation was on and that revolutionary STEM education was on. And so there are a lot of ways that you can do this, but the first thing that you have to center is the student experience, right? So I was working with a group of chemistry teachers, right? And so this is just an example, right? It's not a direct answer to the question. And they were trying to figure out how to critically contextualize the work that they were doing. They were working with a bunch of kids from Richmond, California. So I grew up in Richmond, California on 7th and Pennsylvania. 7th and Pennsylvania is basically Chevron City, right? So we all have asthma. Everybody over there has asthma because you basically are in Chevron's backyard, right? And so we started with the question, well, when you reach out to a bunch of students, and a lot of adults will answer this the same way, name something in this world that's free, right? And invariably, a number of folks are going to say air, but it's not, because if you live in certain parts of Oakland, right, which is expensive no matter what because of gentrification, even though Piedmont is only a few miles away, right, the prices grow exorbitantly, right? And so part of what people are paying for in those spaces, in those instances, is air quality. Air is not free. So then we started to have conversations around the price of air and how can you quantify that? And why would you want to do that, right? Because you want to do it because there's certain particulates in the air near Chevron, near where these students were, where people who live there have a higher incidence of asthma. So there are ways that you can have these kind of sociological conversations around wealth differentiation and use STEM. Because this is the thing, Ron, and other folks who are interested in this. You don't use math to deliver social justice. You use social justice to deliver math. And when you're able to apprehend that paradigm shift, then it changes the way that you do the work that you do. Whatever your particular discipline is, even if you're a president, like Dr. Bush, his presidency should not be just to insist on the policies and practices that support the institution. Whatever he does as a president, whatever Tabitha does when she was teaching history, should be to use the discipline and the expertise that they have to deliver justice to the students that they've been blessed to serve. And so again, we can talk more about that offline, but I appreciate the question.
I also want to give an example. So going back to some of the work that Professor Weathersby had did with math. So they did a interdisciplinary study. So when he introduced the Flint water crisis as just a national example of how do you assess things statistically, he combined with a chemistry faculty member where they actually tested the water from the communities that they live in within the students who attend Skyline College who are in that class. And so they did the macro level of understanding the role of environmentalism and climate justice, looking at Flint, but brought it down to a local level where they had their water tested by the chemistry students. And then the chemistry students' information was sent back to the math class, and then the math class did the statistical analysis, right? And so you still have it under the auspices of climate justice, social justice, environmental racism, right? That theme is being addressed, but they're doing the statistical work, they're doing the chemistry work, they're doing all the works in the other levels, all under this umbrella.
I would just quickly add in as well, in terms of your question, how do you begin this work? When I look up your equity plan, serving Black students and increasing their throughput for math and English is listed there. So I would address the deans as well as who's in charge of your equity plan and advocate through that route as well, because what you're talking about, that sort of activity doesn't look like it's listed. So I would call it out as an intentional practice to increase the throughput of Black or African American students in both English and math.
Thank you for that. Next question / clarification coming from Catherine. So she's saying what she's hearing or surmising from part of the conversation is the need to redefine success, which to her then means that a redefinition of student learning outcomes would also be important in a way that empowers individual students to meet the SLO on their own terms. So she says, so that by raising up the currently disadvantaged, we are not disenfranchising those who are currently advantaged. This in turn may require change in the way we are okay at grades. Is that what she is hearing? So clarification. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, please.
Is Jeremy here?
No, I think Jeremy had to step off.
Jeremy had to step off? Oh, I would have loved to hear him address that one.
All right, why don't we do this? Well, let's call an audible. Dr. Ed Bush, why don't you address that one?
I don't think you could call audibles. That wasn't in my wasn't in my description. Yeah, I mean, I think definitely I think what you're hearing, Catherine, is correct. I think there is a call to expand notions of student success. But the piece that was critical is expanding that notion through the lens of liberation and emancipatory education, as opposed to trying to define success and still keep it within the present day constraints of the institutions. So when you look at how we structure and how we approach student learning outcomes, most of that structure reinforce again what Dr. Sims talking about, institutionalized racism and white supremacy. So to me, it's not only a success that needs to be redefined, it's our approach to education that needs to be redefined. And so that's the piece you're looking at. Then also in your question, still I think is looking at the current frame where there's winners and losers in an educational system in space. And so we need to challenge that frame as well. It's saying that when we set up an environment where all students' culture and histories and experiences are affirmed, when we use the practice and principles that were outlined in this book and in this conversation, then there's no one who is disadvantaged in that scenario, that all students are advantaged. And so we draw in this false dichotomy of winners and losers because we haven't fully yet wrapped our head around this new approach to education.
I'm just going to follow that by saying yes, absolutely. Also, reverse racism is not a real thing. It doesn't actually exist. So we can have a longer conversation about that offline, but that is not, it's not a zero-sum game, like Dr. Bush said. And so I feel like he answered it as well as I could possibly conceive of. So I'll leave it at that.
Other questions or thoughts or comments? I'm doing my best to track. I don't think I missed any. If I did, okay, I got one from Anita. We are planning on a one-year program on anti-racism for all employees. Any thoughts and ideas around that approach?
So
go with Lasana.
yeah,
You want to tackle that, please?
It was a default setting there. So a one-year program on anti-racism could involve a variety of things. So since this is just a general question tossed out from a thing, off the top of my head, if I were at a table structuring this, the first thing I would do is set out what do we hope to accomplish, right? How will we assess that we are becoming a more anti-racist organization? So first I would come up with, I would design with assessment in mind. So what do we want to measure and how are we going to measure it, right? So what's going to be our measuring qualitative and quantitatively and longitudinally? And then from there, that's going to help shape the program. And so when you're dealing with anti-racism, the first thing you're going to have to deal with is the aspect of the narrative that we've already been given. So you would begin the program with actually interrogating narratives around what we call the meta narrative in this country of the founding of this nation, right? There's a meta narrative. So the first thing you have to do is just address the meta narrative and then those other narratives around particular communities, right? And then once you have addressed the fact that there are some gaps, there's some stereotypes, there's some outright dehumanization within these narratives, now you can get into the fact that now we have to talk about what do we have to know and what do we have to unlearn, right, to become anti-racist, right? And what does that anti-racist journey look like? So if you're talking about text, you got Anti-Racism, an Introduction by Alex Zamalin, right? I don't think you can see it because of the background. Maybe you can see it now. Of course, you have Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist. You also have books that talk about wealth inequality, like Toxic Inequality by Thomas Shapiro, right? And it's a variety of things you can go with. And so you can break it up into, let's look at it from the economic standpoint. Let's look at it from the social standpoint. Let's look at it from the justice system standpoint. Let's look at it from the educational standpoint. And so you can break it down in these constituent parts when you're doing it over a course of a year of looking at specific societal areas, right? How does it work itself out in the franchise? How has anti-racism worked itself out in the electoral process, what we're seeing now with suppression of voting, what we're seeing now with a lot of interjections, but how does that connect back to the grandfather's cause and the poll tax? And if an African-American wanted to go vote in the South, they would have a jar of jelly beans. And say, if you can guess how many jelly beans is in this jar, then you can vote, right? How does that compare? So it's gonna have to be something like that. So just to kind of give a summary, start with, how are you going to assess it? Deal with the narratives that are steeped in racism and dehumanization, and then begin to look at how it manifests itself in certain sectors of society. That's what I would say off the top of my head.
Thank you. Going back to monitor the chat, I don't think I missed any questions. So ask one, and then we'll move to wrap up. And maybe this could be a form of each of your closings. Is that okay? Each of you build on this. If you could change, and then you could add, I guess, whatever additional concluding remarks you would like to each of the panelists. But if you could change one thing in your institution that you believe will remove a significant barrier to lead to better student outcomes, what would be the thing that you would change? What is it that you would attack or dismantle or deconstruct, or what is it that you would build? If it was one thing you had identified from your experience of working within your institutions, or you're working in other colleges, what would be that one thing?
So I can start. So for me, it's fear. I think that fear, there's a paralyzing fear that people have with regard to doing this work, with regard to doing work that centers equity and justice. And I think that fear is a fear of being uncomfortable. It is a fear of wrestling with white guilt. It is a fear of being a person of color and not being heard. It's a fear of being a woman and feeling as though you won't be heard. There's so much fear that it precludes people from reaching their fullest potential. And if we're not able to do that, it's difficult to create an environment where our students can reach their fullest potential. So one of my favorite verses in the Bible is 1 John 4:18, because a lot of times, I ask this question of people of all different ages, well, what's the opposite of fear? What's the opposite of fear? And a lot of people will say bravery and courage, right? And being intrepid. But according to this verse, again, one of my favorite verses, it says, there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. Perfect love. So I want to be clear about the Catholic definition of love, of perfect. It's not flawless. It just means complete. It means lacking nothing intrinsic, right? So if you have a misshapen pizza, for example, if it's not a circle, if it has all of its pieces, you can consider that a perfect pizza because it's lacking nothing intrinsic. So we want to be able to demonstrate love in the face of fear that includes all the necessary extrinsic components of a holistic love. And I'm not saying that you love students, right, in any kind of weird Title IX issue type of way. What I'm saying is you have to love justice. And you have to love equity, and that love will then allow you to work alongside students so that they can reach their fullest potential. Thank you.
And Dr. Sims, anything you want to close with the book series?
Oh yeah,
so
the book series, Lasana and I are editors of a book series. It's called, it's the first one on Peter Lang. So my other book was on Peter Lang. I told them we wanted to write a book on community college. They said that was a new space for them. And as y'all see, we love Frank and Luke and those amazing folks, but it's not often that you get people writing about community college who are actually in community colleges. Normally it's people in four-year colleges who write about what's going on. So we just thought, well, what would it look like if there was a book series that allowed us to speak for ourselves, right? We're always trying to give students a voice. What if we had our own voice to talk about the things that we do? Because who can know it better than the people on the ground, right? That's not to be dismissive of other people doing the work, but I just feel like there's something unique about the voices of people who are doing the work and then writing about it. So that's what this book series on Peter Lang is: educational equity in community colleges. If you want to write something, if you want to publish something, you feel like you're doing some good work and you want people to know about it, you don't have to be ready to write a whole book. We can put together something that's an edited book. If you just have a chapter that you think makes sense, reach out to myself, reach out to Lasana, and we would love to hear from folks if you have something that you want to talk about. So there's that.
Realize that we don't know that we are not experts in everything, that our role is to learning and conversations, to be open to students telling our viewpoints they may disagree with, and have the courage to explain why. And I think for me, that pride, right? It's that pride where we want to be right, where we don't want to be second guessed, where we think that we are the holders of knowledge in a way that precludes our students and others from supporting us in that effort and from making changes, right? It's this pride that says, if my students are failing, it's not me. We all need to take a look at ourselves and re-examine our own practices and be willing to take ownership of how we can improve. So, thank you.
Thank you. I'll go to Dr. Taylor Mendoza, then Brother Hotep, you'll wrap us up and then give your announcement of your webinar that's coming up. So Dr. Taylor Mendoza.
Thank you. So I've been sitting there trying to think about, for me, what's the most important. And I keep going back to the work by Lisa Delpit, where she talks about other people's children and how to educate other people's children. And for me, it's simply care. If you care about my child, my Afro-Mexican child, my Afro-American son, then you're going to have a different position in the classroom, right? You're going to have a different sort of attitude and care and compassion and ensuring that other people's children, my child, gets through. And so for me, I think it's as simple as that. And I think a lot of time we still as educators say, okay, well, that's, their issues or their problems, or that's that community in South Central LA that, I don't want to drive to or give to, or that community in Oakland, or, that community in Lenox, near Inglewood, that's largely Mexican. And so, I grew up in Southern California, so I'm naming those areas that I'm familiar with. And so I don't think we have enough, and I wrote about in the book, civic consciousness around caring about other communities. And so for me, it's really just genuine care and compassion for a child that does not look like you, but understanding that this child contributes to this society and makes the world a beautiful place. So that's probably the most important thing for me.
Thank you, Doc. Quilla, son, bring us home, close us out.
The one thing I would change, to be very brief, is this issue that we have that is conflicting the labor arguments that we have with student success. What's happening is that we're in an era of student success, and we're in an era of completion, and we're in an era of becoming equity-minded educators, and the contract is in direct conflict to that. So how can we be in an industry where the actual labor practices forbid them for doing the things which creates greater outcomes for students? So the one thing I would change is to reconcile the challenges between labor and student success to where the labor contract speaks to how it contributes to student success, and they are not diametrically opposed. So if we can go to the next slide. I would like to announce that tomorrow we will be continuing a conversation like this of sorts with myself, Doctors Regina Stanback-Stroud, Luke Wood, and Frank Harris, addressing anti-Blackness on campus, implications for educators and institutions. This particular talk is not specifically about community colleges. It's going to deal with P-12, community college, and four-year institutions as far as where anti-Blackness exists in those realms. We strongly encourage you to engage in that conversation, share it with your communities, share it with your colleagues, wherever they are in education, or wherever they are in examining social ills. Right now, we have over 12,000 registrants. And so if you're not directly in the Zoom call, you'll be able to access it from a live YouTube feed, which will be closed captioned. So we're really excited to bring this to the greater community, and we're really excited to have Minding the Obligation Gap as co-authors within this entire energy where we're rethinking how we go about this great work. So Ed, say some closing remarks and send these people off with us.
Yeah, we're at 2:00, so it won't be any remarks other than thank you to the panelists, but special thanks to all of you that dialed in, who took your time today. Really shows, again, your commitment to continuing this work. So bless you as we are all on this just journey towards justice. Be good to yourself and be good to those around you. Take care.
Great job.